Usually, a good draft is if you get two or three starters, maybe one of them becomes a Pro Bowler, maybe two of them become a Pro Bowler. That's a really good draft. Maybe you get lucky enough and you have one Hall of Famer, and that makes it a really, really good draft for you. But then there are those certain teams and those certain drafts that really just hit it right out of the park. And that's what I'm here to talk about today are the 10 greatest team drafts in NFL history. Now, a couple of things to keep in mind here to kind of clue you in terms of my rationale or my logic for doing this. You either had to have Hall of Famers or a lot of starters, a lot of production throughout your draft class. You maybe also had to have some steals in there as well. And I also weighted it too towards championships and key components of championship teams. And, as I was going through here and doing this, there were about 14 or 15 draft classes that really stood out to me above the rest, but ultimately I had to whittle it down to 10. Some of the honorable mentions: the 1965 Chicago Bears with the third and fourth overall selections. The Bears with back to back picks chose Dick Butkus and Gale Sayers. That's two Hall of Famers with back to back picks and two kind of iconic players and especially in the case of Butkus, maybe one of the 10 best players in the history of the National Football League. As a Bears fan, why didn't I put him on the list? Because frankly, there have been other teams that have had multiple Hall of Famers taken in round one, and those Butkus Sayers Bears of those mid to late 60s and early 70s, frankly, weren't very good. So, as great of players as they were, they really did not have a whole lot of impact on the organization. I could look at the 1985 Buffalo Bills as another honorable mention, with Bruce Smith as a first round pick, Frank Reich from Maryland as a third round pick, and Andre Reed as a fourth round pick. Three critical components to that Bills team that won four straight AFC championships in the early 90s. Two of them in Bruce Smith and now Andre Reed being Hall of Famers. But again, ultimately, excuse me, they didn't win a championship. They didn't win a Super Bowl. So while it was a really good draft for the Bills, there were just some that were flat out better for other teams. The 64 Browns with Paul Warfield and Leroy Kelly, two Hall of Famers, two key components to the 64 championship team. And you look at a Leroy Kelly, an eighth round pick. How do you replace a Hall of Fame running back and fullback in Jim Brown, who retired after the 64 season, with another Hall of Fame running back in a very skilled and very underrated all around player in a Leroy Kelly in the eighth round? It was hard to leave them off the list, but I did indeed. The 56 Packers. There were two great Packers drafts in the 50s. The 56 one just didn't make the list. You had Hall of Famers like Forrest Gregg and Bart Starr. You had other solid Pro Bowl players like Bob Skoronski, other solid starters like Hank Greminger. That was a good draft class for him, but I think there was another better draft class for the Packers in the 50s that helped make them the dominant force that they were under Lombardi in the 60s. And then I look at the 45 Rams, a draft that I don't think gets nearly enough credit. Two Hall of Famers in Elroy Crazy Legs Hirsch and Tom Fears. The Rams were an organization and a team in that time in the 40s and early 50s that was a little bit ahead of its time to have such skill position players on the outside like Hirsch and Fears, outstanding. And then other solid starters like Dick Huffman and Dick Horner. Again, a really good draft and part of that 51 championship team of the LA Rams. But ultimately, just quite not good enough to make my top 10 list. So here we go, the top 10 greatest single team drafts in NFL history. Number 10, I will go to my Chicago Bears and the 1936 edition, the first ever NFL draft. The Chicago Bears were able to find two Hall of Fame linemen. That was Joe Stidehar and Danny Fortman. These are two linemen, two key pieces to that great Bears dynasty of the 1940s. So why did I pick them over the 65 Bears of Butkus and Sayers? You might say, who are Joe Stidehar and who's Danny Fortman? Well, I'll tell you who they were. They were two Hall of Fame linemen that were a part of that great Bears dynasty of the 40s. What they were a part of puts them over the 65 Bears draft, in my opinion. Number 9, the 1957 Cleveland Browns, drafting a Jim Brown 6th overall as a part of that great 57 draft might have been just enough. To have the greatest fullback in NFL history and one of the greatest players in NFL history fall to you at number 6. Just outstanding. But then you get another Hall of Famer later in the draft in Gene Hickerson. You get a quarterback who was a part of your 64 championship team in Milt Plum, a couple-time Pro Bowler. And then, if you want to really throw it in there, they drafted another Hall of Famer technically in that draft, even though he really went on to be a Hall of Famer for another team, which was Henry Jordan. So they technically drafted 3 Hall of Famers in that draft class, and 2 of them played key roles for the Browns in the 50s and early 60s for those good teams under Paul Brown, the one that went on to win the championship in 64. Number 8, the 1995 Tampa Bay Buccaneers. You were able to get Warren Sapp at pick number 12, which was a steal in and of itself. I bet 11 other teams picking ahead of them are kicking themselves for allowing that to happen. And then late in the first round, you're able to follow that up with another Hall of Famer in Derek Brooks. And the reason that these guys make the list, let's say over a 65 Bears or a 45 Rams or a 64 Browns, is because people got to understand just how bad that Tampa Bay Buccaneers organization was. They've got to understand just how insignificant and inconsequential that organization was, how bad it was, and just how much Warren Sapp and Derek Brooks came in and changed the culture of that organization. And you follow that up with Tony Dungy. These two guys fit perfectly into that cover 2 system and were a part of that 2002 championship team, and really, like I said, changed the atmosphere, changed the culture, and changed the entire view of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers organization by fans, by media, and by the NFL as a whole. Number 7, the next year, you have another team draft 2 Hall of Famers in the first round with first round picks, and that was the 1996 Baltimore Ravens. Now, this is a Ravens team that was technically going into his first year of existence in Baltimore. They had moved out of Cleveland after the 95 season. That was a mess and that was a debacle. How do you start off fresh in a new city to establish a new identity? You draft 2 Hall of Famers in the first round. You get Jonathan Ogden, like 4th overall. And obviously, he went on to be a great left tackle and a first ballot Hall of Famer. And then, of course, what everybody will remember about that draft is that later on, they were able to get a guy from Miami of Florida, the U, a bit undersized, but fast, very instinctive player by the name of Ray Lewis. And the rest is history. They were the 2 key foundation pieces of that 2000 Ravens championship team, and then Ray Lewis was still technically around and a part of that 2012 championship Ravens team. So again, you can't get a whole lot better than that, but 6 teams managed to do so. But number 7, that 96 Ravens team. Number 7, excuse me. Number 6, my Chicago Bears in 1983. They were able to find 7 starters in that draft for their 85 championship team. You got Covert and Galt in round 1. You got Mike Primetime Richardson in round 2. Dave Duerson in round 3. You got freaking Tom Thayer, the guard out of Notre Dame, in round 4. And then in the 8th round, you were able to find 2 starters in Richard Dent out of Tennessee State and Mark Bortz, the guard out of Iowa. 2 starters in the 8th round, which would be equivalent to the late 6th or 7th round today. And not to mention the fact that Richard Dent would go on as an 8th round selection to become a member of the Pro Football Hall of Fame. So the Bears had 7 starters in one draft, 7 starters on a championship team, one of them being a Hall of Famer in Jimbo Covert, their first round pick that year out of Pittsburgh, the left tackle, who had spent the past couple of seasons before that protecting Dan Marino's blind side. If he would have been able to stay healthy, he was well on his way to becoming a Hall of Famer his damn self. Number 5, the 1986 San Francisco 49ers. Again, you're talking about an organization that was very well run at the time under DeBartolo and under Bill Walsh. And this draft was kind of the crowning signature achievement to me of Bill Walsh's time in San Francisco. They were able to get 7 total starters, but didn't have a single first-round pick. They kept dealing back, and, they were able to get some really, really nice players, a future Hall of Famer in Charles Haley, other guys like Don Griffin and Tom Rathman and Kevin Fagan and Steve Wallace. I mean, it was just a draft that was loaded with contributors for that 49ers team, players that were key parts of the 88 and 89 championship teams. One or couple of them were still there for the 94 championship team. A phenomenal draft for Bill Walsh and that San Francisco 49ers organization. Number 4, the 1981 Washington Redskins. They were able to get 7 total starters out of that class. Just think about this for a second. 7 total starters out of that class. But it was kind of a little unconventional, I guess, in a way that you look at it, because they took Mark May in round 1. They got Russ Grimm in round 3. They traded their second round pick to bring in Joe Washington, who was a starter on that '82 championship team. You had several other players. Dexter Manley was part of that draft class, not to mention the fact, Russ Grimm being a Hall of Famer. They were able to get Joe Jacoby as an undrafted free agent, and that why we'll throw into this draft class too. So 7 total starters out of this draft class, technically, via undrafted free agent, a trade like trading for Joe Washington, a second round pick, and then the other 5 guys that they drafted that actually did start for those teams and part of those great Joe Gibbs teams of the 80s and early 90s. Number 3, when you talk about dynasties and great football teams, you talk about the 60s Green Bay Packers. Well, a key reason for that was their 1958 draft. Now, in 56, they drafted guys like Forrest Gregg and Bart Starr, Bob Skoronski. 57, they got Paul Hornung. But 58, to me, is the crowning achievement. Yeah, even though they got Bart Starr like in the 17th round in 1956, when you look at 58 and you look at what it presented to them and what it gave to that Packers organization, it gave them what I would classify as Lombardi guys. And these were guys that really fit that Lombardi mold. And these were guys that really gave the Green Bay Packers that organizational identity of the 1960s. You look at Jim Taylor and Ray Nitschke, both Hall of Famers. Taylor was that workhorse back that, of course, gained worldwide fame running that famous Lombardi Green Bay Packers sweep. Then Ray Nitschke, he might not have technically been the best player on that great Packers defense of the 60s, but he was truly the identity of that defense. He was the heart and soul. He was the leader on that defense, even with all the disagreements he may have had with Lombardi over the years. Then you take a guy out of Idaho in the middle of the draft, Jerry Kramer, who should be in the Pro Football Hall of Fame, and it's a crime and shame that he's not. And then you look at another guy, their first round pick, Dan Curry, the linebacker out of Michigan State, who was a starter for a few of those championship teams. A total of 2 Hall of Famers, a third guy that should be in the Hall of Fame, guys that were key components to 5 world championships. In the case of Taylor, 4, sure, but 5 total world championships. That has to be respected, and that 58 Packers class truly stands the test of time. Number 2 is the 1964 Dallas Cowboys. You get 3 Hall of Famers, 3 key pieces to those Landry Cowboys teams of the late 60s and throughout the 70s. You get Mel Renfro, you get Bob Hayes, who was a steal, and then in the 10th round, you take a quarterback who had a 4-year naval commitment, military commitment, after winning the 1963 Heisman Trophy, and that was Roger Staubach, who went on to become the Cowboy quarterback of Cowboy quarterbacks, who eventually led the Cowboys to 2 Super Bowl titles in the 70s, 2 other Super Bowl appearances, and there were other Super Bowl appearances mixed in there with the Cowboys as a whole, and this draft class was a key critical component of that, to get Renfro, Hayes, Staubach. There's only one team, one organization that has ever gotten more Hall of Famers in one draft class. Only one. Like I said, the 58 Packers should technically have 3 with Jerry Kramer. His ass should be in the Hall of Fame too. But they've only got Taylor and Nitschke in the Hall right now. You look at that 64 Cowboys class. When people talk about truly great drafts, that draft class never gets talked about. And that's a crime and a shame. But there is one thing that can't be debated. It just can't be. And I sit there and say that sometimes, you might think it's dramatic effect, but this one truly can't. The single greatest team draft in NFL history, bar none, is the 1974 Pittsburgh Steelers. 4 players, 4 future Hall of Famers, 4 key components to that great Steelers dynasty that won 4 world championships in the 1970s. Lynn Swann, the wide receiver out of USC, in round number 1. Jack Lambert in round number 2. John Stallworth in round number 4. And maybe the best out of the 4 of them, Mike Webster, the center out of Wisconsin, in the 5th round. Think about that. They drafted 4 Hall of Famers in one draft class. 4 Hall of Famers that were key components to that 70s Steelers dynasty that won 4 Super Bowls in 4 attempts. Think about that. The dominant football franchise of the 1970s was the Pittsburgh Steelers. 4 championships in a 6-year stretch. And this 74 draft class is really what put them over the edge and really helped establish them as the team of teams in the NFL, if not in NFL history. Lynn Swann, Jack Lambert, John Stallworth, Mike Webster. 4 Hall of Famers, first, second, fourth, and fifth round picks. Incredible. Chuck Noll's crowning achievement in terms of NFL drafts, the Rooney family's crowning achievement in terms of NFL drafts, and the crowning achievement of crowning achievements for all NFL teams when it comes to the NFL draft. For years to come, every draft class, in terms of their greatness, will be measured against that 1974 Pittsburgh Steelers class. And until another team drafts 4 or maybe 5 Hall of Famers in one draft, that will always be the measuring stick, and that will always be the gold standard. Now, you are welcome to chime in down below in the comments and let me know what you think about my top 10 greatest single team drafts in NFL history. Let me know what you think about some of the teams that just missed the list. Let me know if I missed some other teams. I really don't think I did. I think I hit on everyone, but beyond question to me, out of all the great drafts that we've ever seen, the greatest has to be this one that the 1974 Pittsburgh Steelers had, period.